Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody, to this discussion. In the last few months, we have seen an increased focus in terms of political conversation on solving our country's cost of living problems by increasing the supply of critical goods and services, particularly housing, green energy, healthcare, childcare. We've seen former President Obama and Vice President Harris talk in their DNC convention speeches about the need to cut red tape to build more housing. We saw just this week Congress voted on exempting the CHIPS program building from environmental review to build things faster, similar to the way that, earlier this year, Governor Josh Shapiro bypassed the normal review process to rebuild I-95. All of these and more are part of what some people are calling abundance policy, really getting more serious about building. And our conversation today is to help policymakers better understand what this growing policy movement is really about. To do that, I am thrilled to kick things off with remarks from Representative Scott Peters of California. Representative Peters has been one of the absolute leaders in Congress on promoting supply side reforms to reduce the cost of living. Representative Peters was going to join us live, but unfortunately had to speak in the House floor around this same time. So he shared with us some recorded remarks, which we will hear now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Congressman Scott Peters. It's my privilege to represent San Diego, Coronado, San Marcos, and Escondido in the United States House of Representatives, and it's great to be with you all today. I commend you for taking action and discussing pragmatic ways we can elevate solutions to some of our nation's most pressing concerns. In San Diego, like the rest of the country, we are facing a housing crisis. Americans in red districts are feeling this just as much as Americans in blue districts. In Congress, I've been a champion for dedicating more resources to our communities to subsidize rental costs so our neighbors with the lowest incomes don't get pushed into homelessness. But we're reaching a point where once someone finally receives a housing voucher, after years and years of waiting and struggling without help, they can't find any housing that's within their budget, even with the subsidies. And that's the thing. Federal subsidies won't get people into homes if those homes don't exist. There are a lot of challenges in the way of increasing supply: local zoning and land use laws, parking minimums, environmental review processes that are being abused by NIMBYs. Our best strategy is infill housing, both to address our community's need for more housing and for the benefit of our climate, because infill uses vacant or underused land in already developed areas for new construction, and it prevents sprawl, which requires more taxpayer investments and results in longer commutes, more pollution, and more congestion. When it comes to zoning reform, it can be difficult to navigate from the federal perspective, since we need to rely so much on our local partners. The best thing we can do at the federal level is to incentivize our local partners to make changes to reduce restrictions. That's the approach I took with my Build More Housing Near Transit Act, and I'm thankful to the Chamber of Progress for endorsing that bill. It's a bill that aims not to be overly prescriptive, but by tying transit dollars to pro-housing action, it appeals to local governments to make those changes. Unfortunately, these regulatory burdens aren't exclusive to our housing system. We face many similar challenges with building our green energy future. Last Congress, we provided record funding to build a cleaner and more secure energy system through historic legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. This Congress, we need to work on speed, because we can have all the money in the world and we'll still fail if we don't act faster. The stakes are incredibly high. According to research from Princeton University, 80% of the projected emissions reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act depend on building transmission faster. 80%. To hit our climate goals, we need to build 200,000 miles of new high voltage transmission lines by the 2030s. Now, over the past decade, we've just built 1,800 miles per year, because each one takes more than 10 years to complete. In the 1970s, our environmental priority was to stop dirty projects. We were on the defense. But now, if we want to cut our emissions in time and build the green energy infrastructure of the future, our country needs to go on the offense. We have NEPA to thank for a great deal of environmental protection, but its implementation is inevitably slow, with documents that are thousands of pages long and reviews that take more than 4 years to complete. I'm continuing my work with my colleagues in both parties to push forward a comprehensive permitting reform package that will help us meet our climate goals, improve community input, and fix the broken judicial process. We will need all your help and input to build support for these proposals and get them across the finish line. Thanks for including me in today's event, and I look forward to engaging with you on all the topics that we talked about as we move forward. Good luck to you all, and thanks for your help.
Thank you to Representative Peters. Representative Peters really has been one of the leaders in Congress on abundance policy, both on the housing side and the green energy side, and his leadership is really very impressive and much needed. Now I'd like to bring in our two speakers, Gary Winslet, who is a professor at Middlebury College and a senior advisor to Chamber Progress, and Laura Foote, the executive director of YIMBY Action. 2 months ago, our organization, Chamber Progress, released what we called our cost of living agenda, which is our proposal for how policymakers can tackle these costs by unleashing new supply side reforms. Gary authored that agenda, and it's available online at bringcostsdown.org. It's focused primarily on 4 areas where costs have risen the most due to lack of supply: housing, green energy, healthcare, and childcare. And of those 4 areas, the policy areas where we've seen kind of, I think, the most focus supporting supply side reforms is housing. And that's why I'm really excited to have Laura join us. Laura's been on the forefront of the YIMBY housing movement for years now. And I think that movement has lessons not just for housing policy, but for other supply challenged areas as well. So we're going to dive right in with questions. Also, if you have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A in Zoom. I'm going to start with Gary. Gary, what are some of the big ways that we see Democratic policymakers responding to rising costs? And tell us, what is abundance policy? Where does that come into the discussion?
Yeah. So typically when Democratic policymakers have thought about costs being too high, their first move has often been to blame corporations. Who's doing greedflation or who's charging too much. And sometimes there are businesses that not everybody loves. People don't always love car dealerships or Ticketmaster, right? But that doesn't actually always take you very far. You usually have a more root cause problem. And then their second solution has often been to spend money to subsidize demand. And that can help. But the problem is that if you've got really constrained supply, then as Congressman Peters pointed out, even once you get a voucher, if there's no house to buy, or if the house is extremely expensive, the voucher just doesn't go very far. And so abundance policy is about recognizing those two things and then saying oh, okay, how can we actually make it so there are more houses, so there's more green energy, so there's a greater supply of healthcare, so that there's actually more childcare provision. It's about making sure that everybody can live the good life, even if they're not super affluent.
So, Laura, when policymakers, particularly Democrats, typically talk about housing, their first go-to is often on affordable housing, providing vouchers, sometimes rent control. Why is it essential to also focus, or maybe even predominantly focus, on building new homes?
I mean, I think this is the hard part, is that we need a both and strategy, right? We have people who have extremely low incomes who we're probably going to need to do some kind of subsidization of housing. I don't know when that ends, but no time soon. But when you constrain supply, and we're talking about constraining actually both the supply of subsidized affordable housing and the supply of market rate housing, we have this systemic supply constraint happening, driven in large part by local governments, by people who have decided that they want to pull up that ladder of opportunity. They believe new housing in their neighborhoods will be bad for that existing community, and so do a lot of different strategies for blocking housing in that community. We have a lot of regulation and a lot of complicated policy that leads to a systemic housing shortage. That shortage hits both the subsidized affordable housing market. We don't not often call it a market, but it really is a market, right? You've got maybe your voucher, you may be on a wait list. If that wait list is years long. In San Francisco, they call it the housing lottery because most people sit on the housing lottery for 10 years waiting for a unit to open up. And in the market rate housing part of the equation, we see the results is not a wait list, but prices increasing. And in both places, though, that's the market signaling that we have a chronic housing shortage. I think the solution has to be more of both.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think in some ways this is a particularly acute problem in democratic cities, democratically run cities, and states, blue cities and states. You see a fair amount of housing abundance, energy abundance in red cities and states. Gary, writers like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have written about the failure of blue states and cities to build. How did that happen, and how can Democratic policymakers kind of overcome that reputation?
Yeah, so I mean, part of how it happened is that in blue cities and states, we did some of that defense that Congressman Peters talked about, but we did too much of it. We treated builders like every time they wanted to build something, like that was an opportunity to squeeze them. If somebody came along and they said, okay, I want to develop this property, build some housing, Democratic policymakers thought, well, okay, this is a favor we're doing to them, letting them build. What can we squeeze out of them as a concession on in exchange for that? And they squeezed and they squeezed and they squeezed so hard that a lot of times the developer just gives up. And that's true in housing, like literally on the builders, but it's also more metaphorically true for providers in healthcare or childcare. We're also, in many ways, building the kind of abundant society we want. We keep treating that as opportunities to do some squeezing. And Democratic policymakers do that because they do, Ezra Klein has called it everything bagel liberalism. I kind of prefer to call it 9 birds, 1 stone liberalism. Like you've got this one thing that's happening, and Democratic policymakers want it to hit 9 different objectives while it's doing the one thing. But like, as anybody knows, if you try to hit 9 birds with 1 stone, you'll probably just miss all of them. And that's how we get things like La Sombrita, the little shade in LA that was like supposed to be a bus stop, but it cost a ton of money. The $1 million toilet in San Francisco. You get things just cost way too much, and it's too hard to build. And it's out of that treating builders as a moment to squeeze, but also trying to do that 9 birds, 1 stone thing. And so if you ask me, like, how can they overcome that? Well, I think we actually need to embrace being a society that builds. Like, I actually think that's the way to think about it because, I often think about it as like musical chairs. Like when musical chairs you play as a kid, there's not enough chairs for all the kids. So the kid with a busted ankle doesn't get a chair. But like, we're Democrats. We want everybody to have a chair. And so the way for everybody to have a chair is just build some more chairs.
Right. To your point about everything bagel liberalism, Senator Brian Schatz did a great podcast interview with Ezra Klein a couple weeks ago, and he took issue with Ezra Klein calling this everything bagel liberalism because he said everything bagels are delicious, which is a good point. So I think the rebrand is probably wise. Laura, this is a big moment, probably a really exciting moment for you as somebody who's been deeply involved in growing the YIMBY movement. We've seen, the last few weeks, Barack Obama, Kamala Harris talking about this in their speeches. We've seen, YIMBYs for Harris having a massive Zoom. Like, is this the moment when the Democratic Party went YIMBY, or is that getting ahead of ourselves?
I think I take a lot of inspiration, but also caution and fear. You can have a moment and still not get your policies across the finish line, right? We're having a moment. The environmentalist movement. In some ways, have they won the rhetorical argument? I don't know, right? These are debates that I think we have. I think we're at a new high water mark on the rhetoric. That much is very clear that we have, the top Democratic, it's not just Kamala, right? It's Obama, it's Biden, everybody saying clearly, not just that we have a housing crisis, but that we have a housing shortage. That's a real improvement in the rhetoric. Shortage gets you to the place where you're diagnosing the problem and saying it then from there falls out a lot of policy implications of what we need to do next. A lot of those policy implications so far that are being proposed are quite modest. They're quite modest, especially when you think about the power of the federal government, the power of the purse, the power to influence local jurisdictions to adopt more pro-housing policies. What we've seen put forward is quite modest. It's going to take a lot more to end America's housing shortage. And we have a rural housing shortage as well as an urban housing shortage. This is the sort of really hard problem, I think, for people to realize, is that the chronic underbuilding of housing is something that is happening in every American city and most American suburbs. We have this net of bad housing policies that are holding back housing production. And where you have economic growth, where you have jobs, you see that we're hitting up against that net, and people are pushed down into poverty. People are pushed out into mega commuting. People are pushed into overcrowding. People are pushed out all the way into homelessness when the economy is pushing up against that net. And so we're seeing that in our superstar cities, right? In all of those blue dot places, you're seeing the economy push up against that net, and people suffer as that net that holds back housing production pulls people back down, pulls the economy back down. The federal government can do a lot. It's going to take, the rhetoric helps, right? The rhetoric helps, every day, because this is happening so much. You can see the results of bad housing policies, especially in blue cities. Having Obama say that NIMBYism is bad is incredible. I don't think he's going to come to the city council hearings and then tell them that they should do upzoning, although I would love to see it. We're going to need to do a lot more. And I think that the federal government can get quite more aggressive on this issue.
Well, that's kind of prompts my follow-up for you, Laura, which is like, yeah, I mean, housing regulation is typically at the state and local level. Federal efforts are kind of early stages here. What would it look like if there's a member of Congress who wants to take bold action on housing? Like, what are the levers?
If there's a local person, they have a lot of levers currently that they can do. They can engage in a local upzoning initiative, in permit streamlining locally. Often there's also state problems as well that need to be figured out. So we see a lot of really great state regulations as well. There's often right now what's happening is a lot of, you can see in Hawaii, in Colorado, in California, of course, the state really taking a more aggressive stance and saying we need our cities to be producing more housing. And so they're passing more aggressive state legislation. The federal government could do a lot more to say, we know that as Congressman Scott Peters pointed out, sprawl is expensive, especially from the perspective of the federal government. And right now, we functionally have the federal government subsidizing sprawl. There's a lot more that they could do to incentivize cities to do infill development. We don't have to have suburbs as much as we do. We could have these old-fashioned things called towns, where they had walkable downtowns. We used to in these sort of what we call now the sprawling suburbs. There's no reason that community couldn't have a vibrant little walkable downtown with apartments right there in that neighborhood that would actually make that community more sustainable. The federal government could do a lot to incentivize those communities, rethinking those growth patterns.
Gary, one thing that's interesting about this debate is it's not really about throwing money at a problem. It's a lot of this is regulatory reform, and sometimes, particularly Democrats, they think of regulatory reform. Well, that's a Republican thing, but there are some examples here of successful supply side reforms that Democrats can emulate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, like, if you look at places that have actually done housing policy really well, Minneapolis is a good example. So they've allowed a lot more apartments along transit corridors, these sort of 5/1 style apartments that are really the workhorse of urban affordability. They've gotten rid of parking minimums. They've allowed duplexes and triplexes on lots that used to be single family only zoning. And so what you've seen is Minneapolis, even though it's one of these really successful blue cities in terms of the job market, it's actually held its rent increases a lot lower than a lot of other places have, and so that's a really good example. But it's not just housing. The way that the Biden administration allowed hearing aids to become over the counter, that combined with technological increases combined with trade meant that hearing aids are now a lot cheaper than they used to be. And so when hearing aids are a lot cheaper, that means even people who aren't well off can afford hearing aids. And that's pretty cool. Like, we people often think of regulatory reform as this kind of dry thing, but like once you get into the actual examples, it's not. Like working class people being able to hear when they're seniors, like that's cool.
Gary, we've talked a lot about housing. There was a big story in the Washington Post this week about childcare in Nevada. A lot of swing voters in Nevada talking about it as a major driver of cost for them. So let's talk a little bit about care. If you're a Democrat or if you're a policymaker and you would like to get serious about reducing the cost of health care and childcare, what are some practical ideas you can embrace in this area?
So one thing you could do is you could get rid of the residency cap. So back in the late 90s, Congress actually capped the number of residency spots. And so there's people who have the drive, ambition, and smarts to get through medical school. And then because of this artificial cap, they can't get a residency. And so what that means is we have all these people who could be great doctors, and they're just not. So we have a doctor shortage. And that residency cap froze in place the geographic distribution of doctors, of those residencies. And so it's the fastest growing places that actually have the worst, most acute doctor shortage. So we could get rid of that cap. Another thing you could do is think about updating regulations. I sometimes think there's a better way of talking about it than like deregulating. So there's like a 1938 law that forces sunscreens to be regulated as a pharmaceutical because they make a healthcare claim, which is that they'll reduce skin cancer risk. But being a pharmaceutical means they've got to go through a huge, expensive regulatory process. And so that's why we don't have any new real good sunscreens in the US since 1999. They've got way better ones in like South Korea, the EU. So that would be another way in which I would advocate for just updating our regulatory thinking to make things more accessible to people. On the child care side, we could always expand the child tax credit. That's popular and helpful. You could end the moratorium on the growth in the au pair program. The Trump administration capped that. And so it's limiting the number of au pairs people can bring in. And au pairs, yes, typically are used by the professional class, but they help sort of everybody in that they are expanding childcare supply. You could also think about universal free school lunches, Medicare for kids, a more robust social safety net for kids is, I think, something Democrats could really get on board with.
Just a reminder, if people audience members have questions, please use the Q&A function. We'll get to one or two of those. Laura, I want to talk a little bit about politics about this because there's a lot of suburbanites who say, yes, we should have more housing, but not my neighborhood. No, that's definition of NIMBYism. And you, as the YIMBY movement, has learned a lot about that. And I'm just curious, because you see the same dynamic in other areas, green energy. Yeah, we should have green energy, but just don't build it here. What have you observed about how the YIMBY movement has overcome NIMBYism in housing? And are there lessons from that we can apply to other areas like energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to know is that actually the people who really are active in their opposition is a pretty small percentage of any community. They're actually not very representative of what people actually think on this issue. It's also true that, and so our current system of how we ask people requires them to participate in multi-hour long hearings. Thursday afternoon, come and give public comment in order to make your voice be heard. Okay, so that is going to select for more likely retired, more likely older, more likely housing secure. Anybody who has kids that they're shuffling. I've got 2 kids now, and the idea that I would show up and give public comment for even me, right? I love housing, but like I'm going to show up and support a duplex being proposed in my neighborhood. That's a pretty big lift. And so we know that actually people generally support housing in these communities. They also support the outcomes. I think sometimes when we talk about housing being proposed in the current system, doesn't help people see trade-offs, right? They are like, do you want apartments built in your neighborhood? And you're like, well, all things being equal, not really. But actually, all things aren't equal. Do you want your kid to be able to grow up in that community? And do you want the teachers who want to teach in the schools locally? Are you worried about the teacher shortage? Are you worried about the cost of living for your barista, right? All of those things are actually quite important. But when you ask people like, would you like apartments? You don't hear and think about the cost of not building in your community. You're just being asked kind of an aesthetic question. Do you think aesthetically you want a little bit of change? Well, No, or passionately no. I'm worried that someone will park in my parking lot. So I think this is why we've generally pushed to make decisions at higher levels of government to where you can see those trade-offs, right? Every state has a bureaucracy that knows that that state has a chronic housing shortage. They can pull out that data and tell you, yes, here's the cost that it has to the state. Here's the cost to our overall economy. Here's the cost to these individual communities themselves. Basically every state in the US knows that they have a housing shortage, and they can tell you within a couple of thousand units how bad it is. And so when you push decision making up to where those trade-offs are more visible, and where actually you get more democratic outcomes because people are voting for people, where they are taking all of that into account and electing people at higher levels of government, at the city council level. And I think this is very fair. How many people are actually voting for their local city council member is actually far fewer than the number of people who are voting at the state representative and even at the national. These are all really hard questions. And I think the thing that the YIMBY movement has really learned is that a lot of time, I think this is the sad thing about politics. If you spend all of your time arguing with your opposition, you're not going to get very far. But actually, you have to spend a lot of time mobilizing the people who do see those trade-offs, mobilizing and getting really deeply involved in local government. We have a real problem right now, and I think this is leading to the housing shortage where, young people, at San Francisco, people say, I don't even know what a supervisor is, let alone who my supervisor is, right? This is a real problem, a crisis in local government where it is selecting for older, wealthier community members. And I think this is something that has to be solved in all of our politics. I think that the environmental movement has to take this. I think this applies to kind of everybody. We haven't talked enough about implementation. There's a lot of incentive for higher levels of government, especially to pass a law, declare victory, and then the problem doesn't actually get solved. And this is, I think, a little bit on activists. We have to teach people to be in it for the long haul, to be paying attention to outcomes, to be demanding follow-up legislation to make sure units actually come online. I think that we have tried to make politics easier for people, simpler for people. Send in your $5 a month to, there are a lot of organizations, I'm not going to name, right? There are a lot of organizations, you send them your $5 a month, and that's it. Participatory democracy is critical for actually making sure implementation happens.
A ton of great points there. Thank you, Laura. I'm going to close on a question from one of our audience members, Stephanie Murphy, president of Center Isle Coalition. This is for Gary. Cost remains the top concern for voters. It's the lens through which voters look at every policy. But voters are rightfully skeptical of free stuff. How does this agenda focus on swing voters who want policy that balances helping people while ensuring that those who work hard can get ahead? Gary?
I think that's a great question. I think people, like the questioner asked, want to feel like people are working hard at getting ahead, and that means costs have to be reasonable. The thing that makes people hate inflation is they feel like they went out and they busted their behind for that promotion, they busted their behind for that new, pay raise, and all of a sudden it all gets eaten by higher cost. And it's deflating and defeating, and it's just so frustrating. And so I think part of it is just about talking through how this agenda is really just letting people build things. Like, let people build things, and then it's available on the market, and it's a reasonable price. And then the other thing that I would point out too is that there's a lot of ways in which this agenda can be bipartisan. Yesterday, we just saw Congress pass permitting reform with respect to semiconductors. There's a lot of ways in which permitting reform can appeal to people, both who are super into the environment for climate change reasons, and people who just want lower electricity bills when they run their AC in the summer. And I also think just being really vivid in how we talk about things and being really clear. So like you can talk about minimum lot sizes, but like what those actually are things that are designed to kill starter homes. And so if you want starter homes, you have to reduce your minimum lot sizes. That's going to help people who, that young couple who is just starting out on the property ladder, or that couple that's worked really hard and they want to retire in their community. Well, starter homes help them do that. And so that's just how I would answer that question is we talk about letting people build things, we emphasize that it's bipartisan, and we be really clear about who it is we're helping.
Terrific. Well, that's great. I'd like to thank everybody for joining. And with that, I would like to thank Representative Peters again, to Laura Foote and Gary Winslet. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for joining our conversation, which will undoubtedly be continuing in the months ahead. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day.